Today's story is one of survival so raw, it leaves you holding your breath, unfolding beneath the vast skies of the old American West. Out there, where storms come without warning and fate crosses paths when you least expect it, one moment can decide everything. It started with a single sound, hoofbeats in the distance, quiet, uneven, and impossible to ignore. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. There are places where the wind keeps its own ledger, recording every footstep and every secret ever buried in the soil. Blue Mesa was one of those places. A vast sweep of Wyoming high country stretched beneath an endless sky. Gray sage, brittle grass, and rolling land that rose and fell like the spine of a sleeping animal. It was the kind of country where a person could shed their past, if they were brave enough to leave it behind. Mara Holt had lived there alone for 3 winters. She wasn't a woman the town remembered for her beauty or her voice. If anything, they remembered her by omission, by how rarely she was seen, by how long it had been since anyone heard her laugh. Some said she'd grown silent after her husband died in a mining accident. Others claimed she'd always been that way. Either version made it easier not to look too closely. Mara filled her days with work that asked nothing of her but strength. She patched fences that refused to stay straight, hauled creek water in iron buckets until her shoulders burned, kept the stove alive through nights when the wind pressed against the cabin walls like something with a pulse. She rose before sunrise every morning, because if she didn't, loneliness had a way of waking first. Her hands told the story she never spoke aloud, scarred, split, darkened by sun and labor. Hard hands, honest hands. Yet her spine stayed straight. She moved with the steady cadence of someone who had nothing left to prove and nothing left to lose. The land was cruel, but she never cursed it. She understood its quiet. It didn't pretend. And honesty was the only language she trusted anymore. The Holt homestead sat above the basin on a slight rise, a weather-beaten house leaning as if tired of standing, a barn that groaned when the wind shifted, and a single half-wild horse grazing near a broken fence, and one woman who had outlasted both storms and whispers. She had come west 7 years earlier with her husband, chasing rumors of silver seams and second chances. The mine had taken him whole and returned her empty-handed, bruised, broke, and left to settle debts born of dreams she never asked for. The town's sympathy lasted a season. Pity always melted faster than snow. By the time folks stopped offering help, Mara had already learned not to wait for it. Sometimes, in the gray stretch before dawn, she sat on the porch steps with a warm coffee tin cradled in her hands and listened. Not for voices. She expected none. She listened for signs the world was still moving, the slow creak of frozen trees, frost whispering through grass, wind breathing down from the hills. It was enough to remind her she hadn't been erased. Her nearest neighbor lived 12 miles east. Even that felt too close. People asked questions. Too many. Questions about what truly happened the night the mine burned. About why she no longer wore her wedding ring. About the bruise someone once noticed along her jaw months before her husband's death. She learned the surest way to end a question was to meet a gaze and say nothing. Winter had carved its marks across Blue Mesa, scars that never fully healed. Snow retreated in stubborn patches, leaving earth soft but defiant. Fence posts leaned like men after a losing fight. Still, Mara kept mending. Not because she believed the land could be conquered, but because repair kept her hands busy when her thoughts drifted toward things beyond fixing. That March morning, she worked the south fence, breath clouding the cold air. The ground remained half-frozen beneath her boots. Wire bit through her gloves with every twist, each knot cinched tight as if holding something back inside her. Anger, maybe. Grief. Or that deep, wordless ache that refused a name. The sun broke through a thin veil of cloud, silver and sharp, casting the basin in fragile light. The kind that fooled people into believing spring had arrived. Mara wasn't fooled. She knew warmth could lie just as easily as men. Still, when the breeze carried the faint scent of thawing earth, she paused, closed her eyes. For one brief moment, she allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't feel so heavy, something still worth building toward. Then she opened her eyes and went back to work. There was a rhythm to her solitude, a careful pattern that kept her from thinking too far ahead. Morning chores, repairs, routine, a quiet order that held her together when memory threatened to pull her apart. Mending, feeding the horse, gathering kindling, boiling coffee. Each day slid into the next like pages of a book she knew by heart. Yet somewhere inside that steady rhythm, something subtle had begun to change. Small, quiet, impossible to deny. The land around her was shifting too, easing under the promise of thaw. The ground softened, the air loosened its grip, and with that change came a feeling she couldn't quite name. Wonder, tangled tight with dread, because change meant motion. Motion meant life. And life had a way of demanding more than she felt ready to give. That night, as the last light drained from the ridge, she stood outside the cabin and watched the sky burn itself down to ash. Stars appeared slowly, like embers that refused to go out. She wondered how long it had been since anyone had spoken her name aloud. Then she said it herself, barely above a breath, letting the wind take it. Mara Holt. The name sounded strange on her tongue, as if it belonged to someone else, someone younger, less guarded, someone who might still believe forgiveness was possible. The wind shifted, brushing a loose strand of hair against her cheek. Gentle, almost human. For a heartbeat, she felt less alone. Then the cold crept back in, and memory followed. She remembered who she was now, a woman who had learned that silence could keep you alive, even if it also kept you lonely. But the frontier rarely lets a life stay still for long. In places where the wind remembers everything, it also carries warnings of what's coming next. The following morning, when Mara heard hoofbeats moving through the hollow, slow, uneven, deliberate, she had no way of knowing her life, and her silence were about to be disturbed by someone who understood both far better than she did. Dawn broke hard and brittle, the kind of morning where breath lingered in the air like words left unsaid. Even the ravens held their peace. Mara pulled on her coat, the one patched too many times to count, and stepped onto the porch. The world stood suspended in that uneasy calm that follows a night of hard wind. The sky was pale and unforgiving, flat as tin. Her breath came out white, curling over the railing before fading away. She planned to check the south fence before the frost gave way, but halfway down the ridge, she stopped. Something was wrong. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was listening. A sound drifted up, faint, uneven. Hooves, struggle, and something else she couldn't name. She followed it carefully, boots sinking into half-thawed mud, down toward the edge of her land where the fence dipped near the creek. That's where she saw it. A mule caught fast in the wire, one leg twisted at an unnatural angle, breath steaming with panic. Beside the animal, a man knelt low. One hand rested gently along the mule's neck. His voice carried soft and steady, barely audible, spoken low as if meant for the earth itself. The animal stilled. For a long moment, nothing moved. Mara watched. The man's motions were sure and unhurried, not the frantic scrambling of someone trying to prove himself, but the calm precision of someone who already knew his hands. His canvas coat was worn thin at the shoulders. His hair was bound in a single braid that brushed his back. His skin held the deep tone of sun and red clay. She knew what he was before he ever looked up. Apache. Her father's voice stirred in her memory, old warnings she'd long stopped repeating. Standing there now, in the quiet space between breaths, those words sounded small. Childish. This wasn't danger. This was presence. When the man finally lifted his gaze to hers, there was nothing sharp in his eyes. No threat, no guilt. Only recognition, a silent acknowledgement, steady and unafraid, as if to say, "I see you." A still wordless understanding passed between them, as if to say, "I see you. I mean no harm. I'll leave the way I came." Mara didn't move. Still, her hand drifted to the revolver at her hip. Habit, not fear. He didn't react. No flinch, no reach for a weapon. Instead, he lowered his eyes back to the mule and worked the wire loose from its leg. The animal shuddered, then found its footing, leaning into his touch for a brief moment before limping free. He murmured something in his own language, words carried off by the wind. The fence post creaked softly, almost like a nod, as if the land itself had granted permission. Mara spoke before she meant to. "You're on my land." Her voice was steady, firm without edge. The man looked up again, eyes dark and calm as wet stone. "I know," he said. The sound of his voice caught her off guard. It wasn't rough, not the way she expected. It was low, clear, unhurried, the kind of voice that made silence feel intentional. She narrowed her eyes. "You planning on cutting through my fence while you're at it?" He shook his head once. "Just fixing what my mule broke." Her gaze flicked to the torn post. "You could have left it." "I could have." He paused, then added, "But it was yours." The words struck harder than any threat. She had no reply, so she stayed quiet. He finished tying the last strand of wire with practiced ease, then stood, brushing frost from his knees. Up close, she noticed the faint threads of silver in his hair, the deep lines at the corners of his eyes. Not age, but years of sun and seeing too much. He moved with an easy strength, the kind that didn't need proving. He rested a hand against the mule's neck, murmured again, then turned east toward the tree line. No goodbye. No explanation. Just gone, swallowed by the cottonwoods. Mara remained long after he disappeared, listening to the space he left behind. It wasn't the old silence. This one felt heavier, full, as if something had entered her world and refused to fully leave. By the time she finished mending the fence, the sun had climbed high enough to melt the frost from the sage. She wiped her hands on her skirt, turned toward the house, and stopped. A small bundle sat on her porch, wrapped in oiled cloth. Her pulse jumped. She crouched, loosening the thin leather strap, half expecting a trick, half expecting nothing. Inside lay a clean-cut piece of smoked meat, neatly wrapped, still faintly warm. No tracks in the mud. No note. She looked toward the ridge, eyes narrowing. The trees stood still. The wind barely stirred. She held the bundle in both hands, unsure what to feel. Pity, she would have hated. Charity, she would have refused. But this wasn't either. It wasn't pity she'd seen in his eyes. It was something rarer. Recognition. The kind that sees the storm in someone and doesn't mistake it for weakness. That night, She sat by the fire, the smoked meat untouched on the table. She didn't need it. Not yet. But she didn't throw it away. Outside, the wind slipped through the cabin's cracks, sounding almost like the voice she'd heard earlier. Calm, certain. The kind that could still a frightened animal with nothing but breath. For the first time in years, Mara noticed her hands weren't shaking from the cold. They were steady. She poured herself a small cup of coffee and watched the flames curl inside the stove, thinking of the man's quiet eyes and the way he'd said, "Because it was yours." Maybe he meant the fence. Or maybe, though she wouldn't admit it yet, he meant the hurt. And that was something she wasn't used to anyone wanting to mend. When she finally put out the lamp, the night beyond the cabin felt altered. Not safer, just less hollow. Somewhere past the cottonwoods, a faint fire glowed. Distant. Steady. She told herself it was only starlight caught low on the ground. But deep down, Mara Holt knew better. Morning came quietly again. The kind of hush that feels like the world holding its breath, waiting to see what a person will choose next. Frost clung to the porch rail, glittering like small promises the sun would soon erase. Mara stepped outside with her coffee tin still steaming. Her breath turned white as she scanned the tree line. She hadn't seen smoke since the night before. Still something inside her, small, restless, told her he hadn't gone far. When she turned back toward the cabin, she saw it. Another bundle, the same oiled cloth, the same thin leather tie, set neatly on the step, as if it belonged there. Her chest tightened. She crouched, untied it, and found a tool. New. Polished, perfectly balanced. A hand-forged hatchet. The cedar handle still carried the scent of smoke and pine sap. It fit her palm like it had been shaped with her in mind. Her first reaction wasn't gratitude. It was anger. Or the echo of it. The kind that rises when kindness edges too close to pity. She wasn't anyone's charity, and she didn't need a man's approval to keep her life standing. Mara set the coffee down, pulled on her gloves, and followed the narrow trail toward the creek, where she'd last seen his tracks vanish. The morning was thin and cold, the air smelling of thawing earth, half winter, half spring. The kind of scent that reminded her nothing stayed frozen forever. She found him exactly where she expected. Kneeling at the water's edge, his coat dark with dew, hands busy stripping bark from a fallen limb. Dusty stood nearby, head low, breathing slow clouds into the air. He didn't look surprised to see her. Didn't even glance up. She stopped a few paces away, her voice low but sharp enough to reach him. "You left something on my porch." He kept working, steady as the creek. "No one else lives this far out." She lifted the hatchet. "I don't need charity." That made him look up. Not startled, not defensive. Just that same calm, measuring gaze that seemed to see everything without cutting into it. "It isn't charity," Kesh said. "It's a tool. Tools help work get done." His voice wasn't teasing, wasn't apologetic, just plain. A truth set down like a stone. No weight added, no meaning forced. Mara drew a breath that felt heavier than it should have. She wanted to snap back, remind him she wasn't some lonely woman waiting to be rescued by decency. But the words didn't come. Instead, she found herself watching his hands, the deliberate movements, the patience in every motion. He didn't rush the silence. He let it live. And that unsettled her more than any boasting ever could. She exhaled slowly. "It's sharp," she said at last. "You'll want to keep it that way." He answered without answering. The corner of her mouth twitched. Half frown, half something else. He'd met her in the narrow space where pride and gratitude could both survive. "You think I can't take care of myself?" she asked. He tilted his head slightly, eyes soft, unreadable. "I think you've been doing that for a long time." The words landed deep. Not painful, just exposed, like a bruise touched with more understanding than it should have known. She stepped closer, close enough to smell cedar shavings and faint smoke clinging to his coat. "You don't know me," she said. "I know the look of someone who cuts their own wood," she said. "And I know when someone's worn out from having to prove it," he answered. Mara Holt studied him for a long moment, steady and unblinking, searching for any trace of mockery, any hint of the condescension she'd come to expect from men. There was none. Only quiet truth. That somehow made it worse, or better. She couldn't tell. "You following me?" she asked. He shook his head. "Watching," he said softly. "Different thing." She almost laughed. Almost. "You got a name?" she said. "Kesh." She nodded once, slow and deliberate. "I know." She blinked. "How?" "Fence post," he said. "Your name's carved there, worn down, but still holding." She didn't know why that made her chest tighten. Maybe because it had been years since she'd thought of her name as something someone might read out loud. Her gaze dropped to the hatchet, the grain of the handle smooth beneath her thumb. "It's a good blade," she admitted quietly. He nodded. Good hands make better work. His eyes met hers, and for a single heartbeat, something passed between them. Not flirtation. Something quieter. A shared understanding that didn't need words to take root. Mara let out a long, slow breath. "Well," she said, almost to herself, "I'll put it to use." "Then it's yours," he replied simply. She turned to leave, but after a few steps, she paused. Without looking back, she asked, "You always give tools to strangers?" His answer came low and even. "Only when they know how to use them." She didn't reply, didn't smile. She just walked away, the sound of the creek trailing after her like a half-finished song. That night, when she split firewood, the hatchet bit clean through the logs, sharper than any blade she'd owned. The swing felt lighter, easier, as if something inside her had stopped fighting back. She stacked the wood by the door, hands trembling, not from cold, but from a quiet that no longer felt like punishment. And though she told herself it was only a tool, not a message, not a sign, she couldn't shake the sense that someone had seen the walls she'd built and chosen not to tear them down, but to build beside them. Evening settled slowly that week, the kind of slow that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. The sun bled out behind the ridge, staining the sky the color of worn copper. Juniper smoke drifted from the stove. Mara sat by the fire, the hatchet resting near the door, her hands raw from the day's work. Outside, wind moved through the cottonwoods, laying a hush over the land too deep to name. She knew that kind of silence well. The safe kind, the one that keeps ghosts quiet. But tonight, another sound broke it. A knock, not sharp, not demanding, just one careful tap against the wood. When she opened the door, Kesh stood there, his coat damp with creek mist, his eyes as calm as ever. He didn't ask to come in. He didn't need to. She stepped aside. That was enough. He set his hat near the hearth and took a seat across from her, close enough for the firelight to catch the edge of his face. They said nothing for a long while. Only the fire spoke, its soft, living rhythm filling the space between them, the sound it makes when two people have nothing left to prove. At last, Mara poured 2 cups of coffee from the tin pot and slid one across to him. He nodded once in thanks, and the quiet that followed felt strangely full. Her voice dropped below the crackle of the fire. "People think my husband died in the mine. Mara Holt said. She didn't lift her eyes. Kesh didn't either. He didn't move, didn't even blink. He only waited. Mara's fingers tightened around the coffee cup until the heat bit her skin. He died drunk on me. The words sank heavy, like iron thrown into deep water. She drew a slow breath and kept going. I told the town he fell down the shaft. They believed it. Maybe because they wanted to. Maybe because it was easier than knowing the kind of man he really was. Her voice wavered, then steadied. The truth is, he used to come home from the saloon with that look. You know the one? Like the world had wronged him, and somebody had to pay for it. Her jaw set. And I was always there. The fire popped softly, sending a thin spark into the air. She stared at her sleeve, hesitated, then rolled it up. The skin beneath was pale, lined with faint scars, marks time could dull but never erase. I used to think if I worked harder, she said, eyes fixed on the flames, kept the house clean, spoke softer, he might turn gentle again. She swallowed. But cruelty, once it gets a taste for you, it doesn't let go easy. Her eyes stayed dry. Her voice was steady now, like she'd said these words 1,000 times in her head and finally let them loose. The night he died, he came home meaner than I'd ever seen him, said the mine owed him, said I owed him more. Her breath caught. When he raised his hand again, something inside me broke. Not fear, not even anger. Just exhaustion. The kind that sits too deep to move. She swallowed hard. I grabbed the lantern off the table and threw it. Didn't think, didn't aim, just threw it. The fire took him fast. And when it was over, she said quietly, there was nothing left but smoke and silence. The cabin went still. Only the sound of her breathing filled the space. Rough, uneven. She waited for Kesh to speak, to judge her, to offer comfort, to tell her what she already knew about sin and guilt. He did none of it. He only said, as softly as wind moving through dry grass, "You survived him." Mara looked up then, really looked, and saw no pity in his eyes, no judgment, no sermon waiting behind his tongue, only understanding. The kind that belongs to someone who has seen too much cruelty to confuse survival with shame. Her lips parted, but no words came. Her throat burned, not from tears, but from the release of holding them back for too many years. They sat like that for a long while, the fire low, their breathing slow. In that quiet, something shifted. Not forgiveness, not yet, but space. Space for her story to exist without punishment. Space where she wasn't a secret or a sin. Just a woman who had endured. After a time, Kesh spoke again. My mother, Naya, used to say scars are proof the body remembers how to close. He paused. She was right. But the spirit takes longer. Mara nodded slowly, eyes on the firelight. You don't look at me like you're sorry for me, she whispered. He met her gaze. No, I look at you like someone who's still here. That was all. No grand comfort, no promises of redemption, just truth, quiet, honest, and enough. Outside, the wind softened against the cabin walls. The night seemed to breathe out with them. For the first time in years, Mara didn't feel the need to bury her story beneath the noise of her own work. She let it rest between them, like another log on the fire, warm, steady, still burning, but no longer dangerous. She didn't thank him. He didn't expect her to. Some things don't need words. Some silences aren't empty at all. When the last ember faded low, Mara Holt realized she hadn't pictured her husband's face once while she spoke. Only her own, caught in the firelight, still breathing, still here. For the first time, she believed what Kesh had said. She had survived him, and somehow that truth marked the beginning of everything that followed. The days that came after carried a fragile kind of peace, thin as early ice over a thawing creek. Mara felt it each morning when she stepped outside to begin her chores, the steady rhythm of two people learning how to share quiet. Kesh never lingered long inside the cabin, yet his presence remained, the way calm stays behind after a storm has already passed. Some days he split wood by the barn. Some days he patched the corral fence. Other times he vanished into the hills for hours, returning with nothing but dust on his boots and a steadiness that eased the loneliness of the land. She didn't ask where he went. He didn't explain. In that simple understanding, trust took root, silent, unseen, like seed beneath frost. One afternoon, the air warmed enough for snow to loosen its hold, dripping from the eaves in slow, steady beats. Mara was hauling water from the well when she heard it. Hoofbeats. Fast, sharp, wrong. Not the slow, deliberate pace of Dusty. This sound carried arrogance, the kind belonging to a man who believed the land already answered to him. She straightened, wiping her hands on her apron as the rider came into view. A tall bay horse, a fine coat, polished boots, and a smirk that hadn't aged any better than whiskey left too long in the sun. Cole Ransom, a name she couldn't afford to forget. Years earlier, after Daniel Holt died and the mine debts came due, Cole had offered help, said he'd settle the accounts if she signed the land over, said no woman should shoulder a ranch alone. When she refused, he laughed, told her pride was a man's trait and she'd starve clinging to it. He'd been wrong, but not wrong enough. He reined in a few yards from the fence and tipped his hat, as if manners could still hide cruelty. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "Didn't figure you for the kind to take comfort from a savage." The word landed hard, cutting clean through the thin calm of the afternoon. Mara didn't move, didn't flinch. Her face stayed steady, though something old and cold stirred behind her ribs. Kesh had been near the barn, stacking lumber. He paused, straightened, turned, slow, deliberate, unreadable. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't need to. His silence weighed more than any rifle. Mara stepped forward, boots crunching over half-frozen mud. "You're on my land, Cole," she said, her voice sharp enough to slice through his grin. "And I don't owe you a damn thing." Cole laughed, a dry, mean sound. "Oh, I remember that tongue. Sharp as ever. But I didn't come to fight. Just thought I'd see what kind of company you keep these days." He glanced at Kesh, his smile curling. "Does he work for you? Or you working for him?" Mara's hand tightened around the bucket handle until her knuckles burned white. "Get off my land," she said again. "Easy now," Cole drawled. "Didn't mean offense. You always were a prideful one. I just—" She cut him off. "You talk too much for a man who never learned how to listen." That stopped him, not because he cared about her words, but because of how she said them. Not loud, not angry. Finished. He studied her a moment longer, then spat into the dirt, turned his horse, and rode off without another word. The sound of hooves faded down the ridge, swallowed by distance, leaving only wind and the slow groan of the barn door rocking on its hinge. For a long moment Mara Holt stood where she was, the air around her tight with the echo of anger and relief colliding. When she finally turned, Kesh was watching her, quiet, steady. "You're not going to say anything?" she asked. He shook his head once. "What would I say that you didn't already?" Her brow creased. "He insulted you." Kesh gave a small shrug, his gaze calm. "He insulted himself." "That's not how it looked." He studied her for a moment, the faintest trace of a smile passing across his mouth. Men like him see what they need to see. You spoke the truth. That's enough. She frowned, half anger, half something she didn't yet have a name for. So you just stay quiet. Let people think whatever they want? I've lived long enough, he said softly. People think what they want no matter what you say. But you said it clean. That matters. The wind shifted, carrying a thin chill across the open field. Mara looked at him then. Really looked, and felt something in her chest ease. He hadn't stepped between her and the insult, hadn't raised his voice or his hands. He'd let her stand on her own. And she realized, with a slow ache, that no man had ever done that for her before. Later that evening, when the chores were finished and the light had drained from the land, they sat side by side on the porch. Neither spoke. The world settled into quiet again, but not the old silence that buried pain. This one honored what had been faced. At last, Mara turned to him. Why didn't you fight him? Kesh kept his eyes on the horizon. You already did. The words were simple. Too simple. They struck her harder than any praise could have. He said them like a fact, something plain she'd forgotten she was allowed to believe. A warmth spread in her chest, slow and steady. For the first time, she didn't feel small inside her own story. She wasn't someone's victim, or rumor, or burden. She was simply herself. As night fell, and the last light slipped off the mesa, Mara didn't wonder whether she could stand alone anymore. She already had. And now, for reasons she couldn't yet name, she no longer had to. Spring came early that year, not gentle, not patient, just restless. Snow vanished too fast, creeks swelled, and the wind took on that uneasy edge, half warning, half promise, that only the plains know how to carry. For days, the sky hung low, dark as bruised tin. Mara felt it coming before it broke. She smelled it in the air, rain and earth tangled with something sharp and electric. By dusk, the wind had risen to a growl. It rattled the windows, clawed at the shingles, hissed through the gaps in the barn wall. Mara moved fast. She cinched ropes tight, latched doors, dragged feed under cover. Every movement came from survival, learned the hard way. No panic, just motion, muscle, memory. When the first thunder rolled across Blue Mesa, it wasn't just sound. It was a tremor through the ground itself. Rain slammed down sideways, soaking her coat, stinging her skin. She fought the wind like an old enemy, shouting into it as the fence she and Kesh had repaired began to sway, rails groaning under the pressure. She dropped to her knees, hammer clenched in numb fingers, driving nails back into wet wood. Her breath burned sharp in her chest. Then, through the roar of the storm, she saw movement, a shape cutting steadily through the rain, bent against the wind, unyielding. Kesh. No coat. No words. He was simply there, his hands already working beside hers, as if he'd always been meant to be. He didn't ask what needed doing. He didn't tell her to stop. He simply moved in beside her. And for the first time in years, Mara Holt didn't feel alone inside the noise. They worked until the fence finally held, until rain streamed down their faces like tears neither of them had time to shed. Lightning tore the sky open, white, violent, turning the ridge bright as day. Thunder followed, cracking so hard the ground shuddered. The roof of the chicken shed ripped loose and slammed into the mud. Mara lunged toward it, but Kesh caught her arm. He shook his head once, firm. The message was clear. Not now. By the time the storm broke, the world fell into that stunned quiet that comes after chaos, when even the wind seems too tired to move. The land lay bent in places, broken in others, but alive. So were they. Mara stood in the gray edge of dawn, soaked through, shaking with cold and exhaustion. Her hands burned from rope and splinters. One palm had split open, a thin line of blood mixing with rainwater. She didn't notice until Kesh reached for her wrist. "Let me see," he said softly. "It's nothing," she muttered, trying to pull back. He held her hand, gentle, firm enough to stop her, careful not to hurt. He studied the cut in the fading light. "You'll need to clean it." "I've had worse." He nodded. "Still needs tending." He guided her to the porch and pulled a small tin from his coat pocket. Inside was a thick green salve that smelled of pine and smoke. He pressed it into the wound with steady fingers. The sting made her flinch. She looked away, jaw tight. "You don't have to do that." "I know," he said simply. When he finished, he wrapped her palm in a strip of cloth and tied it with a knot that would hold. "You don't have to carry everything," he said quietly. She lifted her eyes to him, tired, fierce, and full of something she didn't yet know how to name. "I don't know how to stop." They stood in silence, then Kesh spoke again. "Then let me stand beside you while you learn." The words were soft, but they landed deep. Not an offer, not a plea, just truth. They stayed there a long while, shoulder to shoulder, watching the rain fade into mist. The air smelled of wet cedar and dark earth, of things damaged but not ruined. The storm had taken pieces of their work. It had also left something behind. Proof. Mara looked out over the soaked land, the fence line shining under a weak sun. Her hand throbbed, but the pain didn't trouble her. It reminded her she was still alive, still learning how to let someone share the weight. For the first time in a long while, she didn't brace herself for what might go wrong next. She simply breathed and let the morning arrive. Months passed. Storms gave way to sunlight that lingered longer each day, and the land around Blue Mesa began to bloom again. Cautious at first, then sure. Peace crept up on Mara like warmth, returning to a limb she'd forgotten she had. Mornings came slow and quiet now. 2 coffee cups rested on the shelf by the stove. 2 plates sat on the table. 2 pairs of boots dried by the door. Kesh never said he lived there. She never asked him to. Somehow, without ceremony or permission, he simply stayed. It was a strange comfort, the kind that didn't need naming. They worked in rhythm, the wordless kind that forms when 2 lives begin to trust the same silence. He mended fences. She planted early seeds. Some days they spoke only a handful of sentences. It was enough. And for Mara Holt, enough had always been the measure of grace. One evening, she stood before the cracked mirror above the wash basin, brushing her hair. A loose strand slipped across her cheek, and she caught her reflection, not the worn, hardened woman who had survived, but someone softer, someone almost at peace. The sight caught her off guard. Mara set the brush down, palms pressing against the wooden counter to steady herself. The quiet in the room was gentle now, the kind shaped by trust, not emptiness. And yet, within it, she heard something else. Whispers. Faint, but real. They drifted all the way up from town. Rumors traveled far on the prairie. Someone had seen Kesh at the feed store. Someone else had noticed 2 coffee tins resting on her wagon seat. By the time the talk climbed back up the ridge, it had grown sharp edges. The widow Holt took in an Apache, they said, living together, like man and wife. No preacher, no papers, no shame. She heard it from Tommy Reed, the mail boy. his face red, his words stumbling over each other as he tried not to meet her eyes. He didn't mean harm. The world simply loved gossip more than truth. That night, Mara barely slept. The fire burned low, the cabin walls breathing in the dark. Kesh was outside somewhere, repairing a gate by moonlight. She watched him through the window. Steady hands, calm shoulders. A man who neither hid nor boasted. A thought settled over her, sharp and certain. Freeing. She had spent half her life carrying shame that was never hers. She wasn't about to pick it up again. Before sunrise, she saddled her horse. The sky stretched wide and gold, the world washed clean by last night's rain. Kesh looked up from the woodpile. "Going to town?" he asked. She nodded. "Need supplies?" He said nothing more. Just reached up to the shelf and handed her the small coin pouch. No questions, no hesitation, only trust. That, she thought, is love in its truest form. The ride down was long and quiet, the kind that leaves room for thinking. When she reached the main street, the town was already stirring. Porches swept, wagons hitched, eyes pretending not to stare. They followed her from the blacksmith to the feed store. Whispers curled behind cupped hands. Mara dismounted and tied her reins, slow and deliberate. She felt the weight of their judgment, curiosity dressed up as politeness. Still, she didn't rush. She walked into the general store like a woman who had every right to occupy that space. Because she did. Behind the counter stood Ruth Calder, frozen mid-measure with a scoop of flour. "Morning, Mrs. Holt," she said, voice tight. "Morning," Mara replied, calm as wind over grass. She gathered her goods, coffee, salt, a spool of thread, as the silence thickened, heavy as storm air. When she reached the counter, she felt every eye waiting, hungry for explanation. She met them all with a single look. Clear, unflinching. Then she said, quiet but certain, "If you want to know what love looks like, it's out there mending my fence." No one spoke. Not a sound except the floorboards creaking beneath her boots. She paid and left. Outside, the sun was climbing over the ridge. For the first time in years, Mara felt taller than the weight of other people's thoughts. She rode home slow, wind cool against her face, the land wide and golden ahead. The whispers would continue. She knew that. They no longer mattered. Because for the first time since she'd buried her past, she wasn't surviving a story someone else had written. She was living her own. The seasons turned again over Blue Mesa. Land once scarred by storms and silence learned how to bloom. Spring slipped into summer, fields filled with the hum of bees and the soft rush of wind through new grass. Mara rose each morning before the sun cleared the ridge. Coffee warmed on the stove, 2 cups waiting, side by side, and a quiet contentment that didn't need a name. There was no declaration. Peace had become its own kind of prayer. They built slowly, the way patient hands build anything meant to endure. A new wall added to the cabin. A roof repaired one board at a time. A small nursery taking shape beside the window, not only for children, though maybe someday, but for hope. A room meant for something gentle to live in. The days settled into rhythm. Kesh chopped wood, the steady fall of his axe keeping time with birdsong. Mara Holt planted rows of herbs and cabbage, humming now and then, not quite a song, just the sound of someone no longer afraid to fill the air. Evenings belonged to quiet, the kind that comes only when 2 souls have made peace with where they've been. They sat together on the porch, watching the sky fade from gold to violet, then deepen into indigo as the stars came out. They didn't need many words. Their silences carried everything that mattered. Sometimes the wind rolled down from the ridge carrying old ghosts, judgment, memory, pain. But they never lingered long. The house and the life growing inside it had become too strong to haunt. One evening, Mara stood by the garden gate, hands dusted with soil. Kesh joined her, setting his tools aside, eyes following the horizon. The sunset spread wide across the mesa, copper and rose streaking the sky. They stood without speaking. At last, she said softly, "Some loves aren't made for songs or stories." He waited. "They're made for mornings that begin in peace." Kesh nodded. His hand brushed hers. A simple touch, honest and familiar. Together they watched the last warmth of day spill across the land they had both fought to call home. The wind still carried memory, but it carried laughter too. And that, she thought, was proof enough that love could heal what the world had tried to break. In the distance, a coyote called, low and mournful. But even that sound felt different now. Less lonely, more alive. Night rose gently, wrapping the world in stillness. Mara looked at Kesh, firelight flickering in his eyes, and realized she no longer measured time by loss. She measured it by lighter mornings, by a heart that no longer braced for pain, by the way peace had built itself around her, one small act of trust at a time. When she finally spoke again, it wasn't a thought. It was gratitude. "Thank you for standing beside me," she whispered, like a prayer. He smiled, just barely. "Always." The stars came out, soft as memory. The earth rested, and Blue Mesa, once wild, once unkind, felt almost like a promise kept. "Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Your presence means more than you know. If today's story awakened something inside you, don't let the trail end here. There are many more tales of courage, devotion, and faith waiting to be discovered. Subscribe, comment, share, and come back as we continue this unforgettable journey. Thank you, truly. Aviso Legal. Disclaimer. All stories are intended solely for entertainment and may include fictionalized scenarios or dramatization derived from historical contexts. While AI assists in production, human creators supervise and adjust every piece to maintain sincerity, credibility, and emotional quality. We adhere entirely to platform regulations regarding AI content, ensuring no deepfakes or misleading portrayals. Licensed materials are used responsibly. Republishing, modifying, or extracting content without authorization is not allowed. We appreciate every viewer who respects originality and creative effort.